This. Do you know what the name of the talk is? Sorry? I think they put a name to our joint discussion, like a title. Do you know what it is?
Well, I'm not sure there is a title. Is there for this discussion?
I think I saw one.
Oh.
I'll have to.
Events.
Ti mi daj znak, Niki.
No, it's just Europe's future colloquium.
A warm welcome to everyone here in the library of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and to all of those of you who are watching us virtually. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm currently the acting rector of the Institute and a permanent fellow, and I head the Europe's Futures program here at the Institute. This is the beginning of the 4th year of the Europe's Futures Fellowship, and with the generous support of the ERSTE Foundation here in Vienna, Austria, we have been able to conduct this fellowship where we bring together every year anywhere between 6 and 8 fellows working on a range of issues, basically on the issues and challenges to democracy. Secondly, broadly writ foreign and security policy issues, where we include migration, among other. And last but not least, the issue of the enlargement of the European Union, in particular as it pertains to the Western Balkans, what I call the last unintegrated part of core geographic Europe this year. We will also be addressing the issue of the relations between China and Europe. And finally, also, we will have fellows looking at the green agenda, or any combination of those topics. I'm very happy to introduce today 2 of our fellows for the academic year 2021-2022. And to my immediate left is Oana Popescu-Zamfir, who comes to us from Romania. Oana runs one of the most prominent think tanks in Romania called a Global Focus Center. She was also a state secretary of foreign policy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania. She was also with Aspen, Romania for a time. She covers geopolitics and security in the EU-NATO neighborhood, EU affairs, democratization, human rights, and asymmetric threats, among all other things. Currently, she directs the Democratic Resilience Index project, the first quantitative instrument specifically designed to measure democratic resilience in Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. And from what I gather, it will be expanded to some other countries. I will later introduce Wojciech Przybylski, who is to my further left, not to my extreme left. And I will tell you something about him. But first, Oana will talk about, in particular, this issue of the research she is conducting, which is also the project that she will be doing here on democratic resilience. There was a tentative title, Weaponizing Society versus Democratic Resilience. So Anna, explain to us what you will be working on and what your more general approach to this is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To your question, I'm still hoping to figure that out during this month here. And I thank you and IWM and the ERSTE Foundation for the opportunity to delve into this more deeply. But frankly speaking, I hope that the most interesting things today will be those asked, not necessarily answered. And what I'm going to try to propose is actually a framework for looking at democratic resilience, which is an essentially internal mechanism, and the way it influences foreign policy decision-making and orientation, which I think is will very well complement Wojciech's approach, which is more global. And all of this in a context where we see the active weaponization of those both internal and external vulnerabilities that we have by our geopolitical competitors. And I'm gonna propose a three steps approach. Democratic resilience first. I'm going to argue that the main thing we need to do is to bring back representation, and that the current democratic deficit that we're facing is not so much in the rise of nationalists, populists, xenophobes, radicals of all sorts. Those ideas might be anti-democratic, but their expression is not. It's actually part of the democratic free speech and negotiation of consensus. But in fact, the democratic deficit is in the fact that not all voices in society genuinely enjoy political representation. So they are not part of the essentially democratic consensus building negotiation. The second step is how that translates into foreign policy orientation. And the main thesis that I rely on is that the current global competition is all about competing systems of values and models of governance. And so if we have a problem of democratic resilience in our countries, that will translate very likely into an advantage for our global competitors who propose an alternative model of governance. And then all of this against the backdrop of this active weaponization of our own societies, which means discourse, political discourse, is very much used to wage the battle that I was describing. It is used to politicize issues related to democratic resilience, but which might otherwise remain as just passive frustrations and disillusionment and dissatisfaction and fears within our societies, were they not politicized and used at the level of public discourse. And also the use of disinformation by both domestic and external actors has become a weapon of choice, not just one of the many in the general toolbox of global competition. And now to play them back somehow, let's go to democratic resilience first, and I'm going to place the most emphasis on this aspect. Why do I say that we have a lack of representation? The radicals, whatever kind they will be, they will say that they are the marginalized voices. And in all honesty, they are. In Central and Eastern Europe, at least, two factors have converged toward that. On the one hand, the accelerated change that we are all facing at a global level. On the other hand, the further acceleration caused by transformation of our societies on the way to European and Euro-Atlantic integration. So for a long time, all that was heard was the modernizing voices. And those voices belonged very much to the mainstream, to us, to a large extent, those who are here today and can afford to have this debate, because our values are very much post-material, and those who are frustrated with the way that we have occupied the mainstream will say that we are privileged and self-entitled, and that we have pushed out while we were embracing the accelerated change that was happening, we have pushed out and failed to help those who were unable or unwilling to embrace the same kind of transformation. Now, apart from having done so, let's say, on a social level, we have also done so on a political level. We have led the debate for a long time. We have, and when I say we, I mean very much the political system. We have failed to understand and to assist, I could say, people's inability to let go of the familiar at the speed that this was happening. Political parties have ceased to be representative because they have invested in their core electorate and mostly relied on their own bubbles without really reaching across the aisle. And we all know about the social and political polarization in our societies. To a large extent, they have stopped campaigning door to door, talking to people face to face. They have relied very much on television and online communication, because again, that's where to a large extent we are. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody is, but that was an easier path to take for many of the political parties, including the new civic liberal parties, whom we expected to, let's say, rejuvenate the political class. I can easily give you the very recent example just of yesterday of the Romanian governing coalition collapsing over the junior party, which is a civic party, a very young party, having to a large extent been unable to genuinely influence things, and which has very much led to disillusionment by their own voters. At the same time, institutions have not reformed. Political institutions have not reformed, and political representation has not reformed in line with the new realities. To a large extent, people progress despite government and despite politics, not thanks to them. If you look at all the polling done among young people, they are a very involved and civically active generation, very entrepreneurial to a large extent, but not politically. They have not, although obviously they feel the need and they have the drive to participate, they don't do it within the established political institutions, but they do it outside of them. And I'm hoping with regard to my work here at IWM that the numerous elections that are taking place across Europe in the coming year will give me a chance to see how political parties are actually campaigning and how the political debate actually unfolds. Is it truly representative? Does it bring a plurality, not just a multiplicity, but a plurality of different voices within political debate? Or do we have predominant narratives, and do we have the same kind of each political party speaking to their own constituency and not much outside of that? Now, moving on to how that influences foreign policy orientation, I said options were formed to a large extent on the basis of domestic grievances, not necessarily on fault lines such as pro-West, anti-West, and so on and so forth. And I will just give you an example, because I know we can talk much more about the foreign policy part when Wojciech has his own presentation. I will give you the example of the Republic of Moldova. They recently had elections. President Maya Sandu came from outside the corrupt groups of interest that have been holding the country in a situation of state capture for decades now. So she's a complete outsider. She was ousted and had to resign when she was a technocrat prime minister without a parliamentary majority. And now herself and her party have swept to power. Now they do have a parliamentary majority following elections, which allows them at least to have a go at genuine reform. To be clear, the giant challenge is only just beginning, but in terms of winning the elections, the reason they managed to do it was they, for the first time, moved past the usual cleavage, Moldova's pro-European future versus Russia's sphere of influence. They did not divide their constituency in terms of geopolitics. They have approached things based on standards of living, if you wish. They genuinely listened, I assume, to the public agenda. They tried to speak to both pro-Russians. They spoke to nationalists. They spoke to unionists who wish that Moldova were integrated with Romania. They spoke to nationalists about standards of living and their expectations in terms of improvement in their own lives. And they didn't touch on the issue of West versus East, which is what's been capturing Moldova for so long. So that is just one example of how trying to not think that cleavages, geopolitical cleavages, are necessarily inherent and they cannot be surpassed, and there is no moving from one part of the spectrum to the other, is that can actually be conducive to finding out that you can change those cleavages by addressing domestic issues. And the pro-Russian vote for Maya Sandu, who is an essentially pro-European voice, has been quite significant. And I will also give you one second example, and that is of elections in Romania, where we have a radical far-right party in parliament for the first time after 2008. And one of the main reasons for that, not the only one, but one of the main reasons is that also given the COVID circumstances, they were the only ones who actually campaigned door to door. They got on a bus, they toured the country, they spoke to people in the street, which all of the other mainstream parties have refused to do. They campaigned on TV, they campaigned online and on social media, but not physically discussing with people. And now, unfortunately, this party is above the civic parties in the most recent polls. And I will close by looking at the context, which is that of as we are witnessing this phenomena of democratic resilience translating into foreign policy orientations, we are not doing so in a vacuum. It's not like this is happening while all other things are equal, but this is happening while our geopolitical competitors have more than understood this kind of dynamics and are using the grievances in our own societies against us, whether through disinformation or influence mechanisms of all sorts or propaganda and so on and so forth. And having worked on that for years now, I often get the question, how do we combat something like that? And I can tell you many ways in which we can fight back, but that is really missing the most important part of the answer. And that is we recapture the communication space. We regain the upper hand. If we're always going to think in a logic of how do we resist, rather than why is it that we have left such ample space to communicators whose goals go against us, and how do we come back to that space to fill it, then we'll always be one step behind. And you know, people feel that democracy doesn't deliver in terms of actual improvement of living standards. Expectations are more or less realistic, in all honesty. And in our region, in Central Eastern Europe, they are often not realistic, but that's a different story. They do feel that it doesn't deliver. They feel that no one will really speak to them or listen to them. And the populists don't come with solutions, as we very well know. They just come to say, we hear you, and we echo the same grievances that you express. And I'll draw a parallel that may seem outrageous, but since Afghanistan is so high on the public and political agenda, I might just as well do it. And that is something that Vali Nasser was advocating in his book, Forces of Fortune, the rise of the new Muslim middle class and what it will mean for our world. His thesis is that we have not moved past the Islamic, non-Islamic dichotomy, and that we have invested in regimes that turned out to have weakened democracy in their own countries and disillusioned their public, from Turkey's Kemalist regime to Iran's Pahlavi to Pakistan to Nasser's Egypt and so on, just because the others seemed to have a more fundamentalist approach. So we started from geopolitics. We said we don't want fundamentalist Islam, so we're going to invest in these other people. But these other people used means that were completely anti-democratic and ended up, despite significant progress and significant reforms that are an enduring benefit to their countries, they have eventually also ended up disillusioning people with the idea of a secular government. And so what we have now is a middle class throughout the Muslim world, which is increasingly influential, but also increasingly Islamic. And what he says is that we need to learn to live with the fact that some rights and liberties will be denied to these populations, and that we should actually support that approach and support that middle class, because it's our only hope for modernization and transformation of those societies. And we need to basically accept that for a while they will not replicate Western values, but they will respond to Western interests. So I cannot help but think when I was reading Vali Nasser's book and thinking of the conservatives and the ultra conservatives in the Middle East, of our own conservatives, and I am wondering, hopefully I will find an answer to that during my fellowship here, if we'll need to find a way to learn to live with the conservatives in our society, and we will need to learn to afford them more political representation and hope that liberalism will prevail through democratic political debate where these ideas will participate, so that in this way we can actually marginalize the ultra conservatives in our societies. And that is, I think this is a difficult and a painful question. And I think for those of us who are hoping that things would only go in a linear fashion, you know, all the way to the peaks of liberalism, that is a very grim perspective for setback. But we have to acknowledge at the same time that there are large chunks of our societies that are simply somewhere way behind us, and that we have sort of forgotten or chosen to ignore the fact that they have, that they are left somewhere behind. So that's why I was saying I'm hoping the most interesting things will rather be asked, not answered, because I don't have an answer to this. I think it's a very complicated question, but hopefully something will emerge even from today's conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, you know, we could start in the US, where the people who have lost out on globalization came back with a roar, thanks to a populist president who made it. But, you know, let's leave that for the moment. But there are similarities with, as all things remain equal. Wojciech, do you have a question or a comment to Oana?
Well,
because we'll open it to Q&A and we'll discuss each presentation in turn.
Okay. No, I find it fascinating. I just wonder how much of a foreign policy also influences the domestic agenda, because in how you seem to portray things, there's a underrepresented parts of the society which then influence the foreign policy. But how much of the foreign policy also is, or the global affairs, are in the hearts and minds of the people who are feeling underrepresented? And I think it's safe to assume it is. There is quite an awareness of the global turmoil, which then gets a voice in the even local debates.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a two-way street, and I was emphasizing just the way domestic factors play into the international arena, but it absolutely goes the other way as well. And I can confirm what you're saying by looking at the findings of our Democratic Resilience Index, which Ivan mentioned. Whose pilot results we have only for Romania, Hungary, and Moldova, but these are widely different countries, so that gives us an interesting base for comparison even for now. And what we found to be one of the most important buffers against democratic backsliding in all three countries is actually the public's adherence to Western principles and support for international organizations, including the EU, NATO, and so on. And you see that at the same time, people have and declare genuine sympathy for the European Union, for instance, in all three countries. At the same time, if you decompose their grievances in the social arena, in the political arena, you will see that what they voice is values that are quite different from the values of these countries. So to a large extent, what keeps a lot of our countries on a pro-Western path is the institutionalized not just belonging to various organizations, and in the case of Moldova, its aspiration to become an EU member, but the general geopolitical narrative of being part of the West. So it doesn't mean that people reject the West in an sort of in defining their own identity when they reject some of the things that they associate with the West. In the same way, they declare various levels of lack of sympathy for the likes of Russia and China. And yet, the same people who say we wouldn't want to have the same kind of political regime as in these two countries, we wouldn't want to be part of any arrangement, security arrangement, let's say, that involves these two countries, they do sympathize with some of these alternative models that Russia, China, and others propose. And what they would like would be a version of being part of the West, but at the same time, borrow some things from competitors. So I think the foreign policy agenda and its echoes and what they hear and see every day in terms of the narrative around a new global competition, new global order, and so on, actually helps them put a name to their grievances. And unfortunately, they're also helped in this process by populist leaders who are more than happy to give a name to these fears that live within societies. So absolutely, it's a two-way street in many ways.
Okay, so I'll open it up to questions and comments that you may have. Yes, please, and do identify yourself, and you'll get a microphone in a second. Over there, Nikki, in the back.
I'm Ruja Smilova from Sofia.
Just speak up, please.
Ruja Smilova from Sofia, Center for Liberal Strategies. And I have some questions with regard to your prospective research, more reflections on some of the points you make. I find the project very interesting, but I have some concerns concerning some presuppositions that I'm not sure that actually hold. And one of the presuppositions is that necessarily those that vote for radical right parties are because they somehow are left behind by economic progress or by a cultural change. And there are recent studies showing that actually it is not necessarily the case that some economic grievances or necessarily cultural grievances that explain support for radical right, and but rather a combination of different factors. And I agree very much that maybe the main explanation is crisis of representation, but the problem I find is with this very generalized narrative about grievances as the cause. And I can give an example immediately with support for Orban in Hungary. Studies suggest that actually support for Fidesz is not necessarily strongest among the so-called losers of globalization or losers of transition. These are and if it was the case, it would be impossible to explain how does Orban command such big majorities. Because it is not the case that, for example, in Hungary, the losers of globalization or transition are necessarily such big majorities, and he does command. So explanation maybe should go beyond these relatively easy explanations of the losers of this or that. So maybe a more complex relationship between grievances, but also the capacity of the leadership has a very crucial role to play. The performance that leaders stage often is an extra explanation that we need to explain their success. So, but yeah, I find this project really exciting, and I hope to have lots of chances to discuss some of the issues you raised. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I mean, let me start by saying it was a clear summary and oversimplification, just for the sake of keeping time and being a bit provocative. But you know, with respect to your comment, one, clearly there's no, it doesn't mean that all the votes for the far right or far left or whatever radical parties come from people who are essentially left behind and losers of transition and so on. I think, again, oversimplifying a bit, there's the hardliners who are also ideologically aligned, who have a much stronger general alignment with everything that these parties represent. And I have chosen to focus on the others who are the swing segment. So the ones who we might wonder, why is it that Viktor Orban has captured them, getting to a majority rather than a minority, instead of the liberal parties capturing them? Then one of the explanations is not necessarily, when I say the losers of this fast change, it doesn't necessarily mean in strict economic terms. In many of our countries, including the country that I come from, the biggest problem is not, for instance, in the poorest communities, in the rural communities. One of the reasons being that in rural communities, you still have support networks. You have the family, you have, everyone. It said, right, it is said it takes a village, right? It's not said it takes a small town or a city. It takes a village, because in the village, people have much stronger ties. So even though they might feel like they're, they are poorly governed, that they don't have the living standards that they wish for, they are more resilient in a way. The worst problem is in small urban environments. That's where change is most dynamic. That is where people emigrate to the West from. That is where you can compare yourself to others who have achieved much higher living standards than yourself. And apart from that, again, it's not just in economic terms, it's in the loss of status. You don't feel as respected, you don't feel as dignified, you don't feel that those you have elected truly cater to your interests. And you generally feel, just, leaving politics aside completely, that you are more helpless than you used to be. And then you associate that, or you are tempted to respond favorably to the calls of the far right and so on and so forth. So I fully agree with you. There's no direct correlation between having the lowest living standards and being necessarily voting for radical parties. It's actually much more nuanced, and in each country the combination is different. And I was discussing with Wojciech yesterday and saying that I very strongly resist the allegation that Hungary and Poland are to always be discussed together because they are representative of the same kind of dynamics. No, they have widely different dynamics. They might be going down the same path in various respects, but for very different combinations of reasons. So fully agree.
Anyone else? Question or comment? Yeah, in the very back. Can't see who it is.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm planning to go back to the Nasser's book and his thesis. Basically, the West would accomplish much more in the Middle East by encouraging and promoting business and trade with the region. But I'm feeling like this argument is somehow, in a way, problematic, but because we need to understand what kind of capitalism and trade actually is he talking about, more important than talking about trade and capitalism. So what do you think what kind of capitalism and also business we need to promote, peace according to Nasser? Because I think, basically a way of trade and capitalism also creating dependency and actually creating inequality in the Middle East as well, as we know from the 1960s debate on dependency theories. Thank you so much.
And it also creates a lot of corruption, and to a large extent, I think we have used that instrument as well in many countries, and not always successfully. I mean, all of these all of the ways in which it could backfire have backfired already. So that's why I chose to pick from Nasser's argument the part where it said we were blind, or we were actually blinded by just one fault line. We decided to look at these societies strictly from the point of view of is this government more fundamentalist or is this government more secular? And we have equated that with democratic and respectively non-democratic for the fundamentalist governments. So what I'm saying is, I think we need to, just as we were discussing earlier, to be much more nuanced about things and understand that democracy doesn't always mean, working with those that we like and who think like us, and then refusing to get out of that bubble, which is what I argue a lot of the civic parties in Europe do, because they are simply uncomfortable talking to those who don't think like them, to a large extent because I think, having been for so long driven by liberalism and democratic ideas and so on, we simply cannot comprehend how can we talk to someone who just denies women's rights, or how do you reason with someone who refuses to separate church and state, or treat all people equally, for instance, and so on and so forth. So, strictly to your question, I think we need to promote a model of economic engagement which takes all these things into consideration, which doesn't do business for its own sake, in the kind of, according to the line of thinking that development breeds democracy inevitably, and so on and so forth. I think that's been proven wrong already. But we need to be very careful to make this an instrument whereby what we try to achieve is genuine democratic engagement, rather than just supporting those that we like. So that was why I handpicked just a part of Vali Nasser's argument.
The support that Europe has in public opinion polls across the member states, and thus in the countries that you're looking at, which is overwhelming. It's anywhere between 60 and 75%. Would you interpret that as a kind of, I would say, reasonable sentiment in the population that the European Union is a kind of bulwark or firewall, that if things go totally wrong, somebody will be out there to impede a total downfall? For example, if you have a government that's, goes very badly, there is the fact that we're sitting at the European table. They will somehow, to put it very, very colloquially, they will save us. Even though there are these, as you said, discrepancies in the value systems when you dig deeper in opinion polls and ask people, what they like or don't like.
Again, I think it's a very complicated mix that varies very much from country to country. It ranges from strictly an aspirational identity issue. We see the EU as being a normative body. We see it as setting standards, which very few other countries have done, with the exception of the United States, which is the other kind of pole in this binomial of the transatlantic alliance. So I think, just like people will respond in opinion polls, will give you answers that are socially acceptable, they will also think that the EU is the embodiment of everything good and modern and so on and so forth. So of course you want want to be part of it. And you don't just say it, you feel it, because that's, you want to boost your self-image as well. You might disagree with some of its actions, you might be frustrated with where it is now, but you still see it in, if you simplify things and just look at the map and say, what are my options? Well, you don't really see many options in terms of really being part of something. There's also, on the other hand, opportunism. It's the EU that we travel to, and I'm talking specifically about Central Eastern Europe and the EU neighborhood. It's the EU where you want to find a job, where you want to study. You still see that as the way to have a better life. You would like to live there and enjoy the living standards that EU member states enjoy. So I think that's been one of the major mistakes that that the West has made, perhaps, in the European integration of Central and Eastern European countries. We have mistaken people's desire to live like in the EU with their desire to change accordingly and to give up those values that were not coherent with European values, and to embrace those of the European Union. And now we look in our societies and we see that Romanians, for instance, who have been traditionally the most enthusiastic pro-Europeans in the region, have never really signed up to treating LGBTQ persons on an equal footing with everyone else. A large chunk of society has never thought that this would be the case. That, you know, they have never really embraced the clear separation of church and state, and the lack of influence of the church in the laws that are adopted at a political level, at a social level, to govern societies. So simple opportunism plays a very important role. Then there's also security. Yes, I mean, we come out of from behind the Iron Curtain. We know that things can end up being bipolar in the world. We know that at some point we might be divided into camps again, and it's the good camp and the bad camp, and you want to end up on the good side of the any curtain at this point. So I think it's clearly a very heterogeneous combination of factors. Every country, I think, is different. But if we look at the European Union as a whole, and what does it have that it can still convince us, and even convince this swing element in society to come back from the brink into the liberal world, I think is to a large extent about delivery. That can it deliver? Can it deliver on its promises, on our expectations? Can it perhaps moderate our expectations? Because in Central Eastern Europe, we have gone through such an artificial process in a way. The integration process meant that we changed much faster than we would have under natural circumstances. So I think we fed ourselves the illusion that this was how things were going to happen always in our lives. And now I think we, you know, I mean, with all the deserved criticism of the European Union, we also tend to be perhaps overcritical and frustrated with the fact that the EU doesn't deliver what we were used to. So I think really the delivery capacity of the EU, and that is something that it had better focus on and soon, is going to play a vital role, because otherwise the likes of China more and Russia a bit less are going to come in and say, look, we can give you something that works. I mean, look at how we manage the COVID crisis, or look at how we manage our own economic development or whatever. And it works because it doesn't have to be so complicated as democracy is.
Thank you very much. Oana, there's lots of food for thought, clearly a lot of questions, important questions, and maybe some answers along the way here. Clearly, it's the complexity and intertwining of these issues that is crucial, and clearly the international environment creates a lot of this, whether it's the economic crisis in 2008 or the migration crisis or Russia's activities, the annexation of Crimea. A lot of uncertainty felt by people in the socio-economic sphere by all of this. And the search for certainty is one where populists thrive on, false pretenses that by, as you said, listening, they have solutions, again, colloquially, what Americans say, snake oil solutions. And then the path to the understanding that actually they won't deliver is difficult. But then I think what is crucial in a lot of the opposition parties, I think it's important what you said, they have abandoned the classical political campaigning and canvassing of door to door. It's obviously not the only reason, but, and we'll see, German elections obviously will be an important one to look at. So again, thank you for accepting to be a fellow. Thank you for your presentation. We'll be discussing more. And now on to Wojciech Przybylski, who comes to us from Warsaw, Poland. Wojciech is the editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight that I'm sure a lot of you have seen already. It's a journal that covers many of these issues of Central and Eastern Europe. And he's also the chairman of the Respublika Foundation. And I must mention here the name of Marcin Kroll, who was the founder, a colleague and friend of many of us who passed away. And in the latest issue of IWM, there are a few obituaries that Tim Snyder and Marcy Shore and myself wrote about. So Wojciech follows in the big footsteps of our late friend Marcin, who was actually also involved in the founding of this Institute for Human Sciences with Krzysztof Michalski, our colleague founder. And Wojciech was also the editor-in-chief of Eurozine, that's also known to you. He leads New Europe 100 and is involved in many activities. He published a book, Understanding Central Europe, which he co-edited. That was published in 2017. And Wojciech will, as Oana mentioned in her presentation, will look at at a larger framework involving many of these issues. And the title that he put to his research project for this year is Future Europe as a Superpower, Voices from Central and Eastern Europe. So Wojciech.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you also for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be at IWM and to exchange some reflections and thoughts and search for answers. It's an open inquiry on my end, and I will rather try to put some questions in front that I have myself, looking at the picture, looking at where we stand as, well, Europeans, members of the European Union also importantly. Looking at Europe, a friend, an Italian retired member of the European Commission, Antonia Carparelli, told us on a podcast a few weeks ago, Europe is a history, true, but Europe is a history full of surprises, which nicely corresponds to the title of this whole fellowship and project, because it's about Europe's future. This is a new dominion everybody is exploring, especially today. Maroš Šefčovič, again, Commissioner for Foresight, stood up and drew 10 points on the strategic foresight future of Europe. Everybody's really looking into the future, and I'm happy also to embark on this quest of discussing what people today have in their mindset when they're thinking about the future. So is the future of Europe a superpower, or it is, and to what extent it still is, the idea that it should be a certain balancing act and the peace project that Europe started and is continuing to be quite a successful peace project, the Europe of today, not the Europe of the past. So in particular, I'm very grateful for the IWM and the ERSTE Foundation as well for inviting me to reflect on it. And it helps me to build on something that I otherwise am engaged perhaps too much on the activist side or you know, less thinking, more doing in all of my work on an exercise that we're doing at Visegrad Inside, foresight exercise, bringing the voices of Central European civil society to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Because this is a task we have put on ourselves, with the funding of, well, among others, European Commission, but other funders as well, we're trying to bring in, through a scenario building exercise, voices of Central European civil society influencers to construct one of our flagship projects, which is scenario build reports and a discussion about recommendations, and bring it as a shadow report to what the European Commission and the Parliament has been preparing, and they're waiting to be launched at a conference as a final report about the conference on the future of Europe in next year. This is, of course, if we look at if we take a snapshot, this whole conference, on one hand, it's President Macron's trick, electoral trick, as he repeats his game from the previous elections. He did big consultations in France about the future of France, and this is how he managed to energize a lot of population, a lot of attention, in a communicative strategy to get engaged, in a discursive strategy to get people engaged into elections. Now he wishes, and he's so far to a certain extent succeeding, energize the whole Europe in order to get elected there. We hope to present this shadow report, also in Paris, and to challenge these perspectives exactly in the electoral game in France. Of course, nobody's going to hear it that much, but still, it's going to be fun. We're looking at it, in a particular situation where most of the civil society in Central Eastern Europe is not really interested in the subject. I mean, the future of Europe, the big dilemmas, China rise, America's maybe relative decline, I wouldn't call it a decline, is not really the main focal point, because we're looking into the democratic setup, democratic backsliding, media, minority rights, the equality issues. And the real participants in the Conference on the Future of Europe are the governments that are so criticized from the side of civil society. So I think it's very important that on the Europe stage, there is a voice from Central Europe that is not necessarily the voice of the governments that are hijacking, in a way, the idea of Europe. Mr. Kaczynski, Mr. Orban have a plan, and they actually have an action, and they're empowered by the Commission, by the design of the Conference of the Future of Europe, because each national government is in charge of organizing the Conference on the Future of Europe. And they're empowered, therefore, to bring in voices to the conference and to the European Union Forum, their voices and their opinion predominantly, in the style of campaigning we know from the style of the governments. They present on how to not get Europe more integrated, or not to have it more democratically secure. That's why I think it is important. And here within this next 10 months, 9 months and a bit, I hope to explore one particular topic, but this is not the only topic, of course, which is important in this setup. The topic is exactly the question of strategic autonomy, some people would say, but it's more the the expectations and fears of the civil society in Central Eastern Europe on the future role of Europe. And we have today the discussion that is, I think the most prominent voice is Mark Leonard from European Council of Foreign Relations for a number of years. That's at least 15. He's been dwelling on this topic of having Europe as a superpower, as a potential future superpower. And one might say yes or no. You know, it's a big question mark. There are other voices like Jan Zielonka of Oxford and also European Institute in Florence, who even would say Europe can be treated as a neo-medieval empire. You know, and there is this discussion, and there is I would say, a growing bubble, a very interesting framework to discuss and to try to understand where we are heading. And there are voices of dissent and concern that Europe should not try to build that, because it brings back a lot of revisionism about European integration. There is a little bit of a resentment against empires altogether in Europe, especially coming from Central Eastern Europe, or generally speaking, from smaller member states. You know, Brexit for Central European countries, but not only, for smaller countries of the European Union, was a big game changer. And I think it's important here to mention that it was also, well, we didn't know what will come out of Europe. And Europe actually came stronger through Brexit, quite interestingly, and through the negotiations, where Central Europeans were tilted towards playing the old game of, you know, three big powers, and always you could link yourself usually to Britain, but also to other countries. So I think in a post-Brexit Europe, we have a situation in which Central European countries should really get engaged, and for sure governments need to be, and the parliaments need to be engaged, but they not necessarily can play only on the past card of what it was, because there is no coming back. Today we hear a lot of voices from those governments, especially from Poland or Hungary, that the Conference on the Future of Europe is, and I quote, an opportunity of Slavic countries to push back against the West. That was another former speaker at the IWM also, Zdzisław Krasnodębski, who is today a member of European Parliament, part of the European Conservative Reformist Group. It's about countering federalist ideas. This is also something we hear from Budapest or Warsaw, but it's many other countries. There is an agenda of upgrading yellow card, which is the yellow card mechanism is sort of an idea that European parliaments could, you know, counter the European Parliament in its legislative action. And also there's a push on, you know, having less of a union of values and more of a union of interests, which is, you know, some people, and there actually many people would like that. I mean, that's, you know, because we don't agree on the values, we should at least agree their interests. This discussion has some tracking in certain groups of the society. I think there is a point to be made here, and I'll be trying to explore how much appetite there is and how much understanding there is in the civil society to be engaged in the process, to speak out for interests of the countries from Central Europe, because not all of our federalist ideas are welcome. Like, I'm not really sure that majority voting on foreign policy of, you know, foreign policy of the European Union would be welcome from, and would be good thing to have. But there are interesting, these tensions that are now brought about because of the big dynamics are worth exploring, and definitely worth bringing up to the table, especially from the point of view of democratic security, especially from the point of view of people who tend to have too much of internal focus and focus too much. I'll try to counter your argument in a way, too much on the domestic and this different strata, what to do with different electoral groups, but should rather focus on the big narratives, perhaps, and the big questions ahead of us, because they will dictate also the smaller steps, and they will bring some order to the mess we're in, also in Central Europe.
Okay, thank you, Wojciech. Oana, would you like to comment or say something or ask Wojciech?
Yeah, and I think Wojciech, this is in no way a questioning of the relevance of your research, but my question would very simply be: do you feel there is a point in the Conference on the Future of Europe altogether? And so, when you say Central European voices should be more prominently heard, should they be more prominently heard in general in the shaping of the European Union, or with respect to the Conference on the Future of Europe? Don't you feel that to a large extent, that is just not how people and states make their voices heard? The process in itself is not conducive to more innovative ideas. And overall, it's a repeat of past, of similar past occasions that did not really yield much in terms of actual vision, actual action, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Very relevant question. No, I think you heard the irony in my voice when I referred to the idea as President Macron's idea, and it's really his game. But once the stage is set, everybody is on it or maybe outside of it. And I think the choice is rather simple, because many important things are at stake. And also, as I hinted, the European Commission is employing this method of policy planning through foresight, through looking into the future, exploring future. You cannot miss the opportunity, because the vacuum is inviting someone else, and it's inviting, as I pointed out also for my piece for Politico, the guys you not necessarily agree with. They have absolutely right to have this voice in the debate, especially their elected governments. But you need to stand ground if you disagree with them on the fundamental process. So in a way, we're already in this process. Mm-hmm. However, I'm critical also of the whole idea of having a conference on the future of Europe this way. So once it's there, you need to do it. And then the second part of your question relates to Central European countries. There is in the process of integration, perhaps in the beginning, nobody even realized how much these different groupings that we also have, the Visegrad group, and now we have so many other groupings. There are the old and the new way of European integration. We have also Nordic Council, Brussels, the Benelux countries, and so on. German-French tandem is a grouping within Europe, and then many other groupings are around. I think, though, that Central Europeans jumping into the European integration only in time started to realize these groupings can be useful. They're actually helping European integration. They provide platforms to debate policies and shape the policy at the council meetings at the with a short time there. So they're essential element, but Central Europeans still don't treat themselves seriously, and then don't involve themselves in the debates, serious policy debates, and also importantly, transnational debates. So again, from my point of view, it's an opportunity to get more mature, to get more European in the process, and to help shape the European public space through one of the bubbles, one of the overlapping and many bubbles within European Union.
Okay, let's open it up. Solly.
Hi, thank you for both presentations. Can I ask a question? On Una's presentation, even after the questions, one question still remains, in my judgment, unanswered. What will the capitalists do? It seems that the German capitalists don't care about workers' conditions or human rights in places they invest within the European Union. And that may be somewhat encouraging to Orban and others. Therefore, don't we have to think about their choices? Because maybe it is my age, the argument about values does not necessarily faze me much. They are dispensable, certainly outside the core countries. What's wrong with empires, Wojciech? After all, it is a political arrangement, and small countries did not always suffer from that arrangement. And if the European Union is something that is supranational, and for one reason or another, several nation states, for protection, for a better future, or so that their educated people could go to the West and live prosperous lives, for whatever reason, they've joined it. So why not empire?
Okay. Oana, you want to?
Yeah, and you know, again, I have a completely unsatisfying answer because I think it's a very multifaceted problem. On the one hand, in many of our countries, the capital, the foreign capital particularly, has been a driver of positive change, which to some extent has probably hit the ceiling at some point. And one of the probably painful questions in the coming years from Central Eastern Europe to Western Europe is going to be, fine, you know, we've enjoyed the proximity and the integration with the European market and so on and so forth, but we've figured out in the meantime that the brain drain that's taken place and the fact that in our societies, people have it easier if they just go find a job in another European country rather than in their own country. That's been that's worked against development overall, including human development. So I think this is, you know, the whole idea of how much has Central Eastern Europe contributed to the development in the economic development of Western Europe and how much has come to us the other way is going to be something that certainly the V4 countries, I think, are going to keep asking. On the other hand, again, and I think we see that in many countries, because we have labor shortages, because at some point we can no longer function as simply providers of cheap labor and cheap products and so on. Many of the companies that work in Central Eastern Europe have actually taken more reformist measures, if you wish, than the governments themselves. In other cases, and I think that's been very much a matter of government deficiency. For instance, in Hungary and in Poland, the authoritarian governments have been quite effective. So that's given an incentive for people to keep voting for them. In Romania, when we had an authoritarian government that tried to go the same way, that was a highly ineffective government. And out of sheer incompetence and not satisfying the expectations of people who had voted for them, they were voted out of government. So really, I think, you know, I'd be curious, in fact, because I feel that you probably have at least a part of the answer, because I wouldn't really know what to reply. I think if we leave it to the market, the market is not going to self-regulate in the direction of human interest. Let's call it like that. But then again, if we're going to have to continue to have inefficient governments and governments that in themselves don't work in the public interest, then it's hard for me to say, are those governments under the pressure of business interests, or do they actually create an environment where the innovation capacity of the business sector is unable to function toward the public interest?
I'm asking actually a much simpler question. Will they choose to be Krupps or will they choose to be Bosches? Look at the United States. Much of the Silicon Valley capital, until they turned against him, had no problems, and certainly Facebook didn't at all, with Trump. And there are obviously very powerful business corporations and business people in the United States who, for one reason or another, continue to support him and his ilk. In so far, partially because of its history, I'm sure, in Europe, you did not have that visible a shift towards authoritarian political movements on the part of big capital. Is that there to stay because values are important? Or is this also under threat? Because if we don't take into consideration the power of those people and the kinds of resources they command, civil society organization, this, that, and the other, at a time when both class and cultural differences or polarizations are so strong, may not suffice in actually establishing a course of action.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to take more of everyone's time with this, but I think the answer again is really, it's not simple, and that there is no single answer. Some of them will choose to just jump on whatever boat will float at any point in time, and just go with whoever is in power. Others, and I'm rather inclined to think that for now in Europe, we're not going to see an alignment of the business sector, of the private sector behind authoritarian forces, but that is to a large extent because we are such a diverse continent still, and because because the authoritarian forces are still the outliers in many places, and they're not in the main locus of power. So I'm rather tempted to say the private sector is an ally for now, but that can change and that can be volatile in the future.
Okay, Wojciech.
What's wrong with empires? Well, nothing and everything. I mean, depends on the perspective. So, you know, I mentioned Zdzisław Krasnodębski. He leads the effort of the European conservative reformers, essentially Eurosceptic group, or they would call themselves Euro-realist group, with a series of debates across Europe, which is called, I believe, the Confederations, Europe's Future, the New Hope. So you obviously think, where is Luke Skywalker here and the Darth Vader? Now, the Darth Vader is in Brussels, and the Luke Skywalker is sitting in Warsaw and Leia in Budapest. They are fighting against the empire. There is an obvious problem with the, setting the stage as an empire where people fight it. It's just in the, let's say, political communication problem. The other problem, I would say, is more deep. It's a deeper problem. It's a problem when you project an empire. You describe you put it in the contemporary or a future perspective. When you project an empire, then I think you're immediately facing the problem of violence. And because empires need to meet opposition. And how do you design violence? I think European dream so far has been, if we take Spinoza's two types of power of, potestas and potentia, was all about authority, was all about authority and potestas, potentia. And potestas, the classical Dahl definition of power to make B what A wants, that wasn't so much, Europe's recent development. If we're projecting Europe as a superpower, we need to answer this question of violence. I mean, how much? And now currently we are looking into the question of, European Commission is becoming political because Eurosceptic government in Poland, for instance, was telling it was political, or Budapest was telling it was too political. Now European Commission is political by saying, well, we withhold your funds now. We're taking political actions. And I'm fine with that. I mean, I'm to a certain extent, I'm happy this is happening because it's for the fight for the democratic security of my country. But at the same time, there is a problem with it because you introduce the political violence into the game, which wasn't that much so before. So I think this is a bit of a problem. And the last problem is a bit with, I would say, nationalism, which is about the memory. I mean, living memory of an empire is, well, maybe not in this country, but in Britain and in Russia is feeding nationalism. I mean, you have the nationalism drive stemming from memorizing that we were once, or maybe still are, or could be the empire. So these are my three problems.
And what's your view of our colleague Tim Snyder's view that Europe is, in fact, not what the kind of narrative goes, that it was created to avoid all future wars after 2 centuries of mutual killing, but actually it's a way of dealing with end of empire for countries like France and Britain?
I very much agree, yes. So we had also discussions in Poland. Poland has a bit of a problem as a country with this perspective, but because then we're not part of it. I mean, we're not. I mean, there is nothing to deconstruct in Poland. Poland is actually too much into its own dreams of empire, or of the past currently. But I do agree. I mean, this is. I mean, if we look at the more practical level, not. All the bureaucracies in Central Europe, except for Polish, they're very efficient in Hungary, also in Czechia and Slovakia, because they do not have to reflect on how to do things. Small countries even, because they already have patterns of action and behavior that come from the legacy. Similarly, France or Germany, or then it was Britain, they were very efficient in governing the country with all the problems, of course, compared to countries like Poland or, I don't know, countries, other smaller countries around. Also because they have had some capacity on the positive side. And on the negative side, yes, it's about containing the problem of memory of empire, not to have empire come back. With such imperial ambitions, but I think now but I don't know if you can project these national ambitions on the European level. It's a open question to me. What would so if instead of having a French empire again, we'd have Europe as an empire. Europe as a superpower. Because within each nation, you're waking up some demons also, right? Of how this empire should look like.
Well, clearly a lot of things are intertwined. Our friend Ivan Krastev is looking at the issue of demography and the democracy, which has a lot to do with this fear of extinction in his home country of Bulgaria. There's this projection we won't be there and nobody will speak our language in 100 years' time. So there's this kind of pulling around oneself and sort of trying to build a wall to others and not accepting others. And the fact that Europe is such a small space where we all do have identity narratives in nations with all the differences is is something that is a challenge. But can I ask you, I mean, given the challenges of China and US in whatever state it is, and all the pronouncement that Europe has to get its act together, become geopolitical, project more, while some saying that Europe is actually, it's a question of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, rather than trying to get its act together. I mean, how do you see, will Europe find its place in this new situation? And clearly there's a lot of attempts with the various military, building a European force, even though the Swedes don't like the idea, we heard yesterday, of an intervention force, etc. What's your prediction? I mean, this is the million-dollar question, but given that you are tackling this theme, or is it just like Luc van Middelbar, we will muddle through?
These are all very relevant questions, and also in the light of withdrawal from Afghanistan, that we can discuss it. But I mean, people saw things more clearly, perhaps through the process that took place. And in Europe, I think there is a soberness coming with it, that we need to be ready to do things ourselves as Europeans. So on the optimistic note, I'll come back to the quote I mentioned at the very beginning. Europe is a history of surprises. And then Brexit negotiations, I believe, were one of the recent surprises, that Europe came out of it stronger and together, despite all the forces pulling it apart.
Yeah, people said that Europe was never so unified as in the Brexit negotiations.
Even with Polish voice within this process, very clearly attached to interest, but also certain perspective and hopes for Britain to remain an important voice, leaning in with everyone else. On the second part, on the power projection, I would like no rush. First and foremost, Europe needs to be able to contain its own problems. Not, we spoke very briefly of Balkans, and Europe needs to do everything in its potential to keep Europe as a peace project together, but not just like keep things as they were. We know the world is changing, and new decades are bringing new challenges, including the demographic one. We need to be not only able, because we are able, but committed, and there needs to be a popular, will to do things. I mean, the governments and the European Union institutions need to have not only the capacity to do things, when we've seen amazing things happening with COVID-19, something EU hasn't been equipped to do. So will to act is being forged, as I understand it. But the discussions on the other side of power projections, of geopolitics, I don't know, I don't understand the word geopolitics. Perhaps some French colleagues understand it better. I know definitely that it exists in the Russian dictionary, but I don't think it's a European Union dictionary that much. So all this power projecting and potestas elements of Europe are in a way foreign. And I think for a good time they will remain foreign to us.
Any burning questions? Oh my goodness, we're out of time, so let's collect the questions that are out there, please. And do say who you are.
Gloria Benedict, just a very, very brief comment. Since we're talking about empires, I just thought I should throw in, there's a book that just came out in Dutch comparing the EU with the Habsburg Empire. It's by Caroline de Grunter. I'm dying to read it, but it's not translated yet. But as far as I understand, her thesis somehow, or the outcome of her investigation, was that Habsburg Empire somehow secured some peace, and that's what the EU is doing, and maybe all the rest we shouldn't expect too much. So that's just another empire angle that is, I think, very different from the one that you mentioned.
Yeah, hello, Zoran Nechev, one of the Job's future fellow. My question goes to Wojciech. You mentioned that there is no much interest for the Conference of the Future of Europe in V4 countries. Why is that so? And the second question, is there a genuine understanding in the Visegrad countries that they have responsibility when it comes to the future of Europe? Mm-hmm. Not only, you know, towards the former West, but also to the ones that they promote to become next member states, and those are the Western Balkan countries. Regardless what it is, you know, qualified majority voting, you know, foreign policy priorities, whatever it is, do they understand that there is a responsibility there in them? Thank you.
Yeah, and Alison.
Alison Smale, somewhat of a fraud here since I was a fellow last year, but it's great to see everybody. I wasn't going to say anything, and then just the last round sort of sparked interest. I think one thing that is very clear in Central and Eastern Europe is that there is a lack of real leaders of caliber. If you think about our discussions, we almost never say, oh, but so-and-so is doing great things in Warsaw, or somebody is doing sort of an interesting political experiment in Bulgaria. It seems to me that there's still too much expectation of solutions that are handed down from other people rather than worked out by these countries and in those societies themselves. And just to tack on in that regard, this discussion, unless I missed the first minutes, but I don't think we mentioned the word Germany once, but maybe we mentioned it 2 or 3 times. You know, very soon there's going to be a new leader of Germany. And to my point again about leadership, it's going to be very interesting to see who that person is and what all of us in Europe outside of Germany will do in response.
Thanks, Alison. So back to you, Wojciech, for a final comment.
Okay.
Or answers.
So yeah, Habsburg, as I believe there is also a great essay by Robert Cooper, and also even Krastev was writing about the, you know, even I think was warning against not seeing what's happening on the peripheries, because this was the lessons of the Habsburg Empire fall, yep. and Cooper was generally making a similar argument, EU as a like Habsburg Empire as a model for EU in a way, in many ways, to look in the mirror of the past. V4, why there is no interest in the Conference on the Future of Europe? First, because there are other topics. There are elections in Czechia, there are elections in Hungary already, you know, there are primaries now for the opposition, and next year. In Slovakia, they're on the verge of collapse of the government. They have corruption scandal within the government that fights corruption. They have, you know, it's like many things on their plate. Well, Poland is also like, you know, no early elections this year, but maybe already in spring. And you know, there are other topics that are pressing. However, there were big ambitions, and pandemic, of course. But the ambitions were high, and the government and the parliament started off early on, and the whole, you know, New Hope thing of Zdzisław Krasnodębski started early last year, as was planned, to be important part of the narrative. For the governments, it's actually good, because they can still push. I'm describing in my other article that I mentioned in Politico, and also extended in Visegrad Insight, how, for instance, Hungarian government is using and it's employing the strategy to use many NGOs that it funds to channel through the messages, and basically simple thing. And the rest of NGOs, whatever is remaining in Hungary, but also in Poland, there are many. It's actually vibrant civil society sphere. They're not interested and engaged so much as they could be, because they kind of don't see the picture. They don't have the perspective. The sense of responsibility towards Western Balkan CAP, I think paradoxically, with these governments, I would even endorse their efforts and responsibility here, because it's clearly they're engaged, these governments, on foreign policy, and they keep an eye on the processes. They are irresponsible in the sense of what Central Europe, especially Visegrad, used to be, which was the beacon of example. You know, it's kind of you know, in terms again of democratic security. Interestingly, they differ. I agree with Oana. they differ. One of the government officials of Hungary in an informal discussion, so I can't quote, said, that Poland is bringing bad name to illiberalism because of how messy Poland is. And, they're doing things more organized and planned, salami tactics, from the old communist times. They've clearly mastered this way. Yes. And Germany elections and leaders, Alison, yes. I mean, yeah, it's another topic and it's the most important perhaps.
No, absolutely. I think we'll look into the possibility of discussing the Germany during September here, maybe a small discussion within the Institute and have some German input into it, but also look at the various perspectives from our countries, how we see Germany and possible change in Germany and possible change in the strategic approaches of Germany to Europe in particular. So that's clearly, Alison, something that I think we're aware of, and clearly we'll be letting you know if we go ahead. But thanks to both Oana and Wojciech for these presentations. It's a great beginning to this year's fellowship research discussions. And so thanking you and thanking all of you who have come and those of you who are in the virtual world, that our next one is next Tuesday at the same time at 4 p.m. Obviously, we'll send out announcements, but this is just to let you know. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.